Welcome to Deals and Disputes with the West Web Law Group.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of Deals and Disputes with West Web, Albritton, and Gentry, where we explore some of the most pressing legal challenges of our time. Today, I'm joined by Shane Nelson, owner and attorney of Blue Bonnet Abstract and Title, and Brian Hanna, partner and attorney with West Web, Albritton, and Gentry. Shane, Brian, so good to have you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Howdy. Good afternoon, Kevin.
So today we're going to talk about real estate transactions. Our episode is called More Than a Real Estate Transaction, a Service-Driven Business Approach. So Brian, let's start with you. Can you walk us through the typical steps involved in finalizing a real estate transaction from a legal and title perspective?
Generally, we start with the term sheet. Term sheet is going to have some of the key deal points that the buyer and seller have agreed on. And we take that term sheet and turn it into a contract. The contract is obviously the binding agreement between the parties to facilitate the real estate transaction. The next step in the process is to find a great title company like Blue Bonnet Title and have them produce a title commitment for us. The attorneys will review the title commitment, or the parties will review the title commitment, and we'll talk about some of that here in a little bit. Next item on the list is to get a survey of the property. Other key milestones include the feasibility period or the inspection period. That's a time period during the contract before closing where the buyer can inspect the property and look at records and make sure the property is suitable for its intended purpose. And you can usually get out of the contract if it's not suitable for that purpose. Otherwise, it continues on towards closing and then funding. Obviously, we've got to pay for the property in some manner.
It's important.
And it is. Sellers especially care about that.
Yep.
And then it's a closed transaction.
Let's talk a little bit about the title itself. You know, I know that there's checks that you can do during a process and things like that. Shane, how do you ensure that the title to the property is clear and free of any liens or encumbrances?
Sure. So first off, we never say it's ever clear and free, right? Properties are always affected by many different things. And so people like to say, hey, is my title clear? We never say it's clear, right? Title insurance is not actually 100% guaranteed that you even own the property, right? We are saying that you are either the owner or that we will ensure your ownership in that property. And so a lot of different misnomers in kind of the title industry. But stepping one step back, as a title company, we're a neutral party. We don't represent anybody, but at the same time, we represent everybody. So my client's not the buyer, my client's not the seller, but I'm supposed to still treat the buyer with the fiduciary duty and kind of the seller with the fiduciary duty. Same as the agents on both sides, right? And so it's a little tricky, whereas a lawyer always has one client. We actually have no clients, but everybody's our client because we're that middleman trying to keep everybody happy and trying to put everybody in the position that we'd want them to be in. So the title company is that neutral party. We handle all the money. So we act as kind of the escrow agent. All the money comes to us. We divvy it out to the seller. Seller wants to get paid. We're paying the agents. We're paying the lawyers. We're paying the tax office. We're paying off liens, all the different things from a money standpoint. We're also making sure all the legal documents are done right, that we're making sure everything's filed correctly for the buyer, for the seller, for the lender. We're also doing the title searching process, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're making sure that the buyer is buying what they expect to buy. I can sell anything with the right exception. So title insurance is really just it's a contract, but it's our obligation again saying that we are insuring something with these exceptions. So I could say you're a 20-year-old girl with certain exceptions, me never, knowing who you are. I would say, well, I've never seen you. And so I'm taking exception. I've never seen you. So if you're different than something you say you are, I'm accepting to that. And all these different things, that's kind of a silly example, but I can assure anything with the right exceptions. So similar to title insurance, I can assure most transactions as long as I have the right exceptions in there. So the buyer has to be very careful of what they're buying and making sure those exceptions are okay with them. Generally they are, but again, that's why you hire, or you might have a good attorney representing the buyer showing what you're buying. Like we were trying to make sure that the seller, all their mortgages are paid off, all their taxes are paid off, all those other issues. We're also protecting the buyer to make sure they're buying, again, what they think they're buying.
From an attorney standpoint, representing one of the parties, let's say the buyer, really looking at the title commitment and trying to make sure, is the title company telling me that the person I've contracted with actually owns the property and has the capacity to sell the property, so I'm dealing with the right party, and that I will have good title, or my client will have good title after the transaction is closed. And also looking at any encumbrances that the title company identifies. We talked about intended use earlier. Is there anything that the title company has identified that's going to keep me from being able to use my property for the use that I have in mind?
Do you guys both generally recommend title insurance?
Yes, I do. Because that's, I mean, I would be stupid not to. No, but I see so many things, and I kind of joke that even if I were buying a property from my parents, I would still do title insurance because you never know. Even if they bought it a couple of years ago, you could have false liens filed on the property. Taxes may or may not have been paid. Somebody could have sold it out from underneath them. You really have no idea. And I've seen, a bunch of different issues, good and bad and ugly, a bunch of horror stories. You really have no idea. You think you own it, you probably do, but are there some things adversely affecting your ownership? And you don't know what you don't know. And so part of the title insurance process is, 99% of people don't need title insurance, but we keep people from not needing title insurance by doing all the checks, doing all the research, doing all of the things that we need to do from a due diligence standpoint to make sure they never need title insurance. And so hopefully by the time we do all the stuff that we actually do every day, that you'll never need title insurance. So yes, I 100% say you've got to use the title company, got to do the right title searching. And in some instances, you're going to need an attorney too to help double check and make sure your intended use, like Brian said, is okay with what you can use the property for. But if you don't use the title company, you really don't know. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Same perspective on that. It is insurance, right? And you hope you don't need it. That's better for everybody if you don't need it, but you need to have it because of the unknowns and what might pop up if you fail to get it and fail to do your due diligence.
So kind of as a quick example, Brian puts together a contract, sends a contract to us or another title company. Is going from party A, the buyer, or buyer B, seller S, for a particular property. Does the seller own it or not? You don't know. We think they do.
We're pretty sure.
On what basis did they put the contract together?
Right.
You don't know. Does somebody else sell off the property or not? Are there liens on the property? Have there mortgages? Have there multiple mortgages filed on the property? Are there tax liens on the property? So you really don't know. You have a decent idea, that you might own it or you're trying to buy it, but you really don't know.
And unfortunately, there's no shortage of bad actors out there.
Sure.
Right? We don't want to live scared and make decisions out of fear, but the reality is there are people out there doing things that are causing problems, and this is a good way to protect yourself from things like that.
And so at the end of the day, for title insurance, we do all the stuff that we do. We close and fund the transaction, record all the documents, make sure everybody gets paid. If there's a mistake that we did, that's going to be on us as a title company. That's where insurance. If there's fraud by somebody else, part of this transaction or on the property down the road, that's part of what title insurance protects. So it's one of those things like health insurance. You hope you don't need it, but if you need it, you've got to have it. If you don't have it, you're in
glad
trouble.
You have it.
Right. And so that's a lot of what title insurance does is, again, that process gets 99% of the, solves 99.9% of the issues. But in those rare circumstances, that's where title insurance helps protect the buyer.
When it comes to the title search, you've mentioned a few things, liens and some other things. What all are you looking for?
So we really look for publicly filed information. So each county, our industry is kind of county, it's per county regulations and what we can search for. So we're looking at the real property records for this property, anything affecting this property, publicly filed. We search and we let the parties know. Some things may be more important than others, but anything publicly filed, we give it at the title commitment and we let the parties know as a full disclosure, whether it's a lien, whether it's a tax dispute, whether there's been different affidavits filed relating to the property. We let the parties know 100% full disclosure, and then the parties, particularly the buyer, and the buyer's attorney can decide, is this an issue or is not an issue? We typically don't go to the property, so we don't see things that are affecting it, like by walking around it. We rely on a survey. So that's not something publicly filed typically, so we have to get information from the parties. And so any information we find from a survey on the land will also disclose that, being relevant to the transaction and relevant to the property. But we're limited to really public disclosure. So anything public records, whether it's the tax office public records, whether it's the real estate property records in that particular county, whether it's some, federal filings and some other, divorce or probate filings, that is what we're limited to, because that's all public filing.
And Brian, what are some of the common legal challenges or red flags you encounter, that could possibly delay a closing?
Yeah. So from a buyer perspective, again, we're looking at the seller. Is the seller the right seller? Are they the party that can contract for the sale of this property? Minerals, oil and gas rights is a big deal in Texas, obviously. And so that's something that we're looking at to make sure what parties own the minerals, because sometimes it's different from the seller of the surface of the property, and what rights to access the property do those mineral owners have, and how does that line up with the buyer's intended use of the property. So we have to be careful about that, and may have to undergo some procedures to try to protect some of those surface rights and access rights. Other things we look at that the title company is going to flag for us in the title commitment are restrictions, restrictive covenants. Is there anything that's been placed on the property that restricts the use of the property in some way? I want to build a store or a restaurant on my property, but there's a restriction in place that doesn't allow for that. The title commitment is going to identify that restriction. We'll take the document and read it and let our client know, hey, this is some of the things you can't do. And if it happens to be one of the things they want to do, that's a problem. So that's an example. We look at easements that are filed on the property. One that happens around here fairly routinely is a pipeline that's going across the property, and you want to have this special spot that you want to build a structure or an improvement, and there's a pipeline running right through it. So what are we going to do about that? Can we move the pipeline? Can we move the build area? Those are things we have to think about and work on during the pendency of the contract, so that we can get out of the contract if we need to and can't address those things satisfactorily. And then also legal access to the property. Is there a road that I can actually get to the property, or do I have to go over somebody else's property to get to my property? And if so, how are we going to handle that legally and get legal access to the subject property? And then on the other side, if I'm representing the seller, these things might pop up, and the buyer's attorney is going to raise these issues. And so we have to deal with them on behalf of the seller if we want to accomplish the sale of the property.
So each transaction is different. And I'll give a couple of examples following up what Brian said. Every transaction is different. Last week, we call it the chicken file. We have a multi-million-dollar property in Round Top, and the seller didn't know there were some deed restrictions and you couldn't have chickens. And so this buyer from Houston is trying to buy a property, and they can't put a few chickens on a multi-acreage property, and, almost blew the deal. Didn't, but there was weeks of discussion on chickens. And how do we get those restrictions? Like Brian mentioned, chickens, it's just a chicken deal, right?
Well,
and,
listen, with the price of eggs these days, I can't blame people for wanting that, that's important.
No, you can't. So that's the example. Dead folks in title. Again, we just closed one, I think yesterday. It took us 7 months. And one of the 11 owners from a dead parent was a felon in California, right? It took us a long time, and we finally were able to get it closed yesterday after a lot of hard work. So I think dead folks, you didn't mention dead folks, Brian.
True,
but anytime you have that somebody who's been deceased in title, it's a whole nother layer of complication. And that's, again, something that we do. And sometimes you have to work with attorneys and trying to iron out the issues. Easements, do they have access or not? They thought they had access, but you don't really have access. And so each transaction really is very different, and you really never know until you open up and do the title search, which is another reason why, we advocate for the title process, title insurance, is you don't know what you don't know.
Not every transaction requires legal representation, right, Brian? Are there certain situations where it's imperative and certain situations where it's not?
Yeah, I would say not every transaction has to have legal representation. I mean, people buy and sell homes all the time. Realtors are really good at their jobs and can help navigate real estate transactions that are fairly routine. A larger commercial transaction probably needs some attention by an attorney for all the things that we've been talking about, because you don't know what's going to pop up and the things to look for.
In the early stages of a real estate transaction, what are some things that people need to kind of do to have their ducks in a row to kind of help them, avoid problems down the road throughout the closing process?
Just the provisions of the contract itself and making sure those have been thought through and work.
And not just thought through, but actually followed up on, or just,
Yeah, that's right.
any conditions of the contract need to be followed up on.
That's right. We talked about feasibility period and inspection period. Is it long enough? Did you give yourself enough time to do a thorough review of the property and the documents that we're going to find in the title commitment in order to make a decision on the property? How much money are you putting at risk during that period? Can you get the money back? Those are some of the key things to think about while organizing a contract.
Yeah. So from title side, we get involved once a contract's done. But that once the contract's done, it's done, signed by both parties, and that's what everybody has to follow. And so whether it's the option period, the due diligence period, whether it is getting earnest money to the title company on a timely manner, because if you have a situation where a seller has multiple offers and the first person with earnest money doesn't get to him in time, there's an issue. And so just once you sign that contract, you have to be very sure that you're following it and be mindful of any of those traps or landmines that you just got to kind of navigate it, and make sure that the seller's doing what they're supposed to be doing per the contract and the buyer's doing what they're supposed to be doing, per the contract, particularly if it's a fast close. Most things aren't fast, but if they have a very short window, everybody on both sides needs to be working from day one to be able to make sure that they can do what they need to do per the contract for a fast close.
One thing that happens fairly routinely, I think, is that the contract isn't given enough attention. Maybe the attorney isn't hired until after the contract is executed, and all right, now we think we need help, and that's probably true, but there were things that could have been done in the contract drafting and negotiation to set yourself up better during the pendency of the contract. Whereas, all right, now we've got a contract and we've got to deal with that. And now an attorney comes into the mix and we may not have some of the flexibility that we want, lose some of the leverage if we've got to go back for a contract amendment that you would have had earlier. Getting an attorney involved in a complex real estate transaction earlier makes sense from that standpoint. You just don't know what is going to come up during the transaction. And so having a very solid contract in place that's well thought out and contemplates various scenarios is a real advantage in a transaction.
I'll give you one example, Brian, where they didn't have attorneys on a contract, and it was for buying acreage, part of the acreage from the seller, and the seller wanted to put all these restrictions in. It was not done well the part of the contract. It wasn't done well in an amendment, in an addendum. Neither side had attorneys at the time. It was sloppy. So as we kind of start getting ready to close a week in advance, there's a dispute between the parties of a contract not well written. It was not done by lawyers. Buyer gets an attorney. They're trying to get involved. Deal's going to possibly fall through. Sellers, I'm kind of involved, being, again, the neutral party. It ended up working, but they had to do a whole lot of negotiations, fell through simply by not having an attorney being able to give a little bit more detail, a little more specificity in the contract to avoid issues down the road.
To put it in a property context, the contract is the foundation of the transaction, and you want a good, solid foundation. You don't want to skimp on that, right? And
Definitely.
So make sure you make sure you put the work in to get a good contract in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. Well, thank you for tuning in to Deals and Disputes with West Webb, Albritton, and Gentry. To connect with Brian and the team, you can visit westweblaw.com, and that is web with 2 B's. Shane, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Bluebonnetabstract.com, closewithblue.com. Either one, you get to us.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate all the insight and the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.